And here we are with the adventures of the enigmatic time-traveling alien and his human companion, the Doctor and Sarah Jane. Our first adventure takes us to a very strange place called the Mandragora Helix. The TARDIS gets sucked inside and something enters it before the Doctor and Sarah manage to escape and land in somewhere in the Mediterranean in the 15th century, when superstition and science were starting to clash. Also, this is the first time we see the alternate control room of the TARDIS, which has a wood motif. Sadly, we didn't get to see it much because at some point in storage, the darn thing warped because it wasn't stored in the proper temperature. And it was too expensive to just build a new one. But what we do see of it, it ended up getting so much attention that even today, fans still appreciate it. Anyway, the Doctor and Sarah Jane unfortunately come across two very dangerous factions. A cult, which worship a pagan deity, whose ranks have infiltrated the local lord, whose father has just died, making him lord, except his uncle wants to take control. And so, he plans to use an amateur soothsayer, who's also an assassin, to take him out just like he took his father out. Meanwhile, the assassin is working for the cult. And the uncle, he's not exactly a saint either. He accuses the Doctor and Sarah Jane of being spies and tries to have them killed. Actually, scratch that. It's just the Doctor he lumps his hatred on. Poor Sarah's almost sacrificed to the cult. Then, the red energy, which kills on contact, so it's very, very dangerous, and it's sapient, finds the cult and contacts the leader, the aforementioned soothsayer, and possesses him, turning him into a monster of some kind with Palpatine lightning powers, which he then gives to the rest of the cult. He plans to plunge the Earth into a superstitious Dark Age, which makes the previous Dark Age look like a hippie commune. Because this sapient energy is so paranoid that humans will become so powerful in the future, relying on science, that they'll supersede its power in the universe. Well, the Doctor can't let that happen, so once he's made contact with the true heir to the throne, the Lord's son, who's also a bit of a scientist and scholar and got a good head on his shoulders, they plan to infiltrate a party that has to be thrown for his coronation, where the cult plan to execute all the local nobility and all the great philosophers and thinkers in one fell swoop. The Doctor manages to rig up a suit which allows him to drain off the energy that the cult leader, the soothsayer, has amassed, and ultimately manages to defeat him. And he gets to meet Leonardo da Vinci. And he even comments on what Galileo's been up to with telescopes. But ultimately, this was basically the vacation for the Doctor and Sarah. Because next, when they end up back in the present, they get blown up. It seems the TARDIS ended up in a quarry that was about to be detonated. Thankfully, Sarah and the doctor manage to survive, barely. But Sarah accidentally finds the remains of a creature that was executed millions of years ago by these aliens from another planet. Only they didn't do it right, and part of the executed being survived. And it takes control of Sarah through the power of a special ring, and it turns her into a very disturbing character. She mercilessly uses the ring to stun people, not kill them, but stun them, and heads to a nuclear reactor to revive the creature, which feeds off nuclear energy, of course. And she insists that the creature must live. And she says it with this childlike voice, which honestly makes me kind of afraid of her. Ultimately, the creature does take form, that of a female humanoid with a crystalline structure. Female because Sarah's female, and she's the first person to touch the remains of the creature. And she reveals that, the creature that is, she was a helpmate to her people, only for some reason others betrayed her and had her executed. And while it's been millions of years, she hopes to rebuild her people and reassert her place as their leader. So, after several nuclear meltdown scares and a couple of deaths, the doctor ultimately takes the female creature to her homeworld along with Sarah. And ultimately, after dealing with several booby traps and a ticking clock in the form of an acid which is slowly dissolving the poor creature, she gets back to a regeneration chamber especially designed for her and rebuilds herself into a male creature who, as it turns out, was a warlord who was trying to take over the throne from the true leader of the people. In fact, he was the one that destroyed the defenses which killed their homeworld in the first place. Well, he built them. I guess it's fitting that he should destroy them too. But he does want to make good on his promise to rebuild his world and his people into a conquering race. Yep, they're just as bad as the Suntarans. But the joke's on him because, as it turns out, the people who survived the global cataclysm decided dead is better, so they collectively took a suicide pill. Basically, the Rock Man is, or the Crystal Man is, king of a dead world. And while the Doctor and Sarah do trick him into falling over a chasm, it's possible he survived and might come back. But only time will tell. After all this, Sarah has finally had enough and decides that she is going to go home. Now, she was kidding, but the joke's on her because the Doctor gets a message from the Time Lords and is forced to drop her off back on Earth near her hometown. Because I guess Time Lords don't want humans on Gallifrey yet. And for now, at least, that's the last we've seen of Sarah Jane Smith. But it won't be forever. Meanwhile, the Doctor finally goes home to Gallifrey, and we see the homeworld of the Time Lords. It's rather garish. From the ceremonial robes to the cellophane-looking walls. Not only did the Doctor get a message about coming home from Gallifrey, or going home to Gallifrey, he got a psychic message saying that the President is going to be assassinated, which is weird because he's stepping down from office and they're voting a new guy in. Unfortunately, the Doctor fails and the guy is killed before naming a successor. But it's strange. Why kill the president if he's going to step down? Turns out, this one Time Lord who wanted to be president but was not going to be voted in, decided he's going to take matters into his own hands. And he decides to employ the Master for help. Now, unfortunately, this isn't the same Master we saw at the end of Frontier in Space. Was it Frontier in Space? The one just before the that one Dalek episode. Unfortunately, Roger Delgado, the original Master, he died in a car crash not long after filming his most recent footage. So they had to get up a new guy. And they explained this by having the Master look like a half-rotted corpse, because apparently he's reached his final regeneration and his body is breaking down. Only hatred and insanity are keeping him alive. And as it turns out, the Master has been playing a long game, trying to get this other guy elected president, so he has access to the vestments of Rassilon, one of the early Time Lord legendary figures, in order to get access to the power source which gives Time Lords the ability to do the things they do. The Eye of Harmony, that big crystal obelisk looking thing on the cover of this DVD. Now, unfortunately, his plans don't go quite the way they were supposed to, because in the assassination attempt, one of the vestments, which is necessary for getting new regeneration power, was damaged. So, ultimately, he gets some energy to keep going, but not enough to completely regenerate. Meanwhile, the Doctor tries to puzzle out who was responsible for all this mess in the first place, because he gets framed for the murder of the president. And he has to go into a computer which utilizes the memory patterns of past Time Lords in order to suss things out. Ultimately, he goes through a gauntlet of trials, nearly gets killed, but ultimately finds out who was responsible. And while it looks like the Master was defeated, ultimately, as the Doctor leaves, Master steals another TARDIS, and the chase begins anew. After that, the Doctor ends up on a planet that's, once again, has two factions vying for control. A group of primitives who utilize the remains of what looked to be a space survey team. Only they live very, very rough. And a group of priests that live inside a spaceship that they've converted into a church. Turns out the Doctor's been here before. Shortly after he regenerated, turns out he came across a survey team, an expedition to this world, and their computer was on the fritz. They didn't realize it, but they accidentally caused it to become sapient. And when the Doctor tried to fix it, he used his brain as a sort of template, which gave the computer multiple personality disorder. So it decided to start playing a little eugenics game. One side would be savage but strong. The other would be intelligent but cruel and dogmatic. Meanwhile, invisible creatures, which were actually manifestations of the computer's multiple personality disorder, started going after people, and the planet's been in chaos ever since. So ultimately, the Doctor has to make it right. He has to convince the primitives not to kill him. He saves the life of one of them, a woman named Leela, who sort of gets under his skin because she's a little bit rough around the edges, but she's not stupid. It just takes her time to understand the Doctor's world. But she gets it ultimately. Excuse me one second. Anyway, the Doctor has to figure out how to get past the creatures that prowl the jungle, get through an invisible barrier, and convince the priests that their computer, the creature they serve, is not a deity, but rather a computer that was supposed to serve them. Excuse me. Ultimately, he does, even though the computer fights back, because having the Doctor be the reason you're crazy, it sort of sours you to his help after a while. But ultimately, the Doctor prevails, nearly getting killed in the process, again. And once the computer was stabilized, it convinced the locals not to keep going after each other. But there's still some matters to settle. For one thing, who's going to be in charge? I mean, yeah, the computer's going to serve them all, but who's going to be in charge of the computer? Ultimately, the locals decide Leela should be the leader, but she doesn't want to be the leader. She wants to adventure. So she basically hijacks the TARDIS. Of course, the Doctor sees some of himself in her, so he doesn't immediately take her back to her home world. He allows her to keep traveling with him. And so they go to a planet which has a mining operation. A world of sand with particulates inside the gravel that are being sucked up by this machine. And it's crewed by both humans and robots. But the thing is, there's a murder mystery going on. Someone or something has been killing people. And one guy suspects it was robots. But it's strange because normally robots aren't programmed to kill. They can't be programmed to kill. The only person who could program a robot to kill is this crazy scientist who's vanished. And what's worse, he thinks robots are the master race because he was raised by them. No human contact, no sense of self. Guy's totally crazy. He actually thinks he's a robot. Unfortunately, he can't be identified because no one's seen his face. No one has a picture of him. Excuse me. Luckily, the Doctor and Leela show up, get accused of murder again, prove their innocence, and ultimately reveal that one of the crew is actually this mad scientist. Meanwhile, another one of the crew, who blames the leader of the expedition for the murder of her brother, well, it turns out he's innocent. What really happened was what happens to another member of the crew, a type of robot phobia, which in this episode is called Grimwade syndrome, named after a writer or effects guy or someone who works on robot episodes regularly and is a little annoyed by it. So they named a mental disorder after him. High praise indeed. Really, it's what's now known as the uncanny valley. The more human a robot looks, the more disturbing it is, because humans and humanoids have subtle facial and body movements to go with their various emotions. And robots can't emote. So the more humanoid a robot looks, the less comfortable you are around it. I guess that's one of the reasons why people prefer R2-D2 over C-3PO. But I never hated C-3PO. He's cool. A little pretentious, but cool. Ultimately, the mad scientist reprograms nearly all the robots except for one. A quote-unquote dumb robot, as in unable to speak, only he actually can speak. He and the other robophobe were sent to investigate the murders and see if this mad scientist can be found. Ultimately, only 2 people are left alive, that is, besides the Doctor and Leela. Well, 3, actually. The robophobe, the leader of the expedition, and a lady. And in an ironic twist, the guy who was accused of leaving a guy out in a sandstorm to die, he ran out because he was afraid of robots, actually. Has to be stopped from letting the villain into the only safe place left on the ship because he thinks the guy is in trouble. So you can never tell a book by its cover. And ultimately, the Doctor uses helium to distort the villain's voice, so the robots will go after him. And the dumb robot, who's not actually dumb, sacrifices itself to send a signal to some of the robots that are left in order to shut them down, which deactivates him permanently in the process. And with the promise of a rescue ship, the Doctor and Leela continue on their way. And they end up in London in Victorian times. I believe it's Victorian. Where there's yet another murder mystery. Girls have gone missing. Only it's not Jack the Ripper this time. Though he is suspected at some point. Nope, it's something far more insidious. And before I go into this one, yeah, there were a few Asian racial slurs thrown around in this episode, as well as a villain character who's a white guy who's made up to look Asian. That's the term known as yellowface. And it is not okay. And while I'm sure lots of people would be uncomfortable watching this serial because of that, there are Asians in the cast who are a little more than henchmen, but still, I try. Plus, even though this particular villain character is inappropriately done, he is a very compelling character. That's him in the top left corner. Lee Sen Chang, a theater performer who works for the real villain, the guy in the center picture, called Wang Chiang. His real name is Greel. He's a guy from the 51st century, and he's a real bad dude. I won't go into the details, but let's just say he is a very, very complicated vampire, and a torturer, and a murderer. Meanwhile, Chang is a very compelling character. He wants to be a famous performer and stage magician, but he gets hoodwinked by Greel because he thinks that Greel is actually a deity called Wang Chiang. And it was Wang Chiang who elevated him to the position he's now in. And his loyalty is basically all for naught. Poor guy's led to ruin. He's very tragic. Which is why it's so frustrating that he's made in an offensive way. Good character, bad portrayal. Anyway, the Doctor and Leela stumble across this murder mystery. Girls are going missing. Turns out they're being basically fed to Greel because he experimented with time travel, only got it really, really wrong. Now he's literally disintegrating and has to feed on the life force of young people, preferably girls. And while the Doctor calls it cannibalism, I call it vampirism, because that's what it is. Meanwhile, the third villain in the group is a creature called a Peking homunculus. Basically a toy, a humanoid, which has a bit of robotics and the brain bits of a pig for some reason. And it was meant to be a toy. In reality, it was a little monster that nearly caused World War VI. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, Greel mentioned time agents because he is from the 51st century. But we'll get into that in a later era. The Doctor and Leela end up teaming up with not one, but two Dr. Watson characters in the course of this Sherlock Holmes-esque story, in the form of Mr. Jago, the theater owner, who for a while works with Chang, but ultimately realizes what he's been doing, and Professor Lightfoot, who is a pathologist. And ultimately, Jago and Lightfoot team up to do their own sleuthing, and ultimately spawn a bunch of radio dramas, which only stopped because one of the actors passed away. That's how memorable they were. The Doctor and Leela end up getting captured along with Jago and Lightfoot, and ultimately find out that after Greel is finished taking the life force out of two more young people, he's going to try to use the time cabinet that got him to Earth again, only it's not going to work, and it's instead going to destroy the planet. Because a 51st century Earth time cabinet ain't no TARDIS. And Greel refuses to believe the Doctor when he says so. Ultimately, Greel and the Peking homunculus get their comeuppance in the form of Greel getting fed to his own life force machine, and the homunculus getting disabled with a simple fuse removal. But not before a lot of goons, Chinese goons, get taken out, because the homunculus is just that crazy. Meanwhile, poor Chang gets his leg munched by a giant rat. Oh yeah, there are giant rats in this story. And I ain't talking capybaras. That's what made him so tragic, by the way. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to be seen as more than just another Asian. And ultimately, that Shakespeare character, the black dude, he gets led astray by a false ally. In this case, a false deity. So yeah, the day is saved, and the Doctor and Leela head out on to their next adventure. But that's a story for another time. And before I go, yes, once again, some might consider this serial offensive, especially towards Asians, but it's got a lot of good elements that may not redeem it, but are at least worth one look. Until next time, this is Mr. J signing out and reminding you, stereotyping Asians is wrong, stereotyping anybody is wrong, and sometimes a good character portrayal is just not enough. And oversized scarves are cool.